So the first paper will be chaired by us two German medievalists. The second speaker is also present already since the beginning of the transmission, because Laura Moretti has designed our logo that shows transmission across the letters and also across the cultures, because it was the caterpillar and the butterfly are from drawings by a German artist from the 17th century who traveled to Suriname to study insects there, Maria Sibylla Merian, and she has made it now so from Germany via Suriname to Newcastle in the former transmission. And the third paper that we are going to hear by Valerie Pellat, she is in Chinese interpreting, and also one of our multilinguists in the school. That's something of the enjoyable nature of the interdisciplinary work here in the school, that we not only have the different disciplines, but also the different native speakers, so in Italian teaching Japanese, and Scott teaching Chinese. All right, so on to our first paper of this panel A, texts, transmission, transformation, and over to Elizabeth Andersen.
As Henrike said, we're sharing this paper, so I've got 10 minutes, so I must keep to time very firmly. And my part of the paper is to is to give you the broad outline of the field that we're working in, and then Henrike is going to focus in on a particular case study. So, our opening slide, reenactments amongst the medievalists. On the left you have Hildegard von Bingen. She's the prototype of the mystical visionary in the German Middle Ages. And on the right you have a Cistercian nun from Medingen in devotional prayer. Hildegard is shown noting down on her diptych the vision of the circle of the year she's describing in her work Liber Divinorum Operum. The Medingen nun is adoring John the Evangelist with a scroll of paper in her lifted hands. The title of our paper, Transmission of Mysticism in Late Medieval Northern German, is part of a bigger project which will eventually result in the publication of a book entitled Companion to Northern German Mysticism from the 13th to the 15th century. We were fortunate, really, because I was in the department before Henrike, and then Henrike came, and we discovered that we had a lot of things in common, albeit we were in different centuries. So we shared an interest in female spirituality in late medieval northern Germany, and that in itself was rather exceptional, because most medievalists, German medievalists, are working in the southwest if they're engaged with mystical literature. I was in the 13th century, Henrike in the 15th century. My lady was actually Mechthild of Magdeburg, and we don't have a portrait of her, so I couldn't put her up for you. And she wrote just one work in German, Das fließende Licht der Gottheit, the flowing light of the Godhead. Why did I engage with her? Well, it's an outstanding piece of imaginative literature in its documentation of the author's relationship with God and with her contemporaries. And it has a great claim in German literature because it was the first text in the tradition of mystical writing that was neither a translation nor a free adaptation of a Latin text, but rather it was an independent and highly individual composition in the vernacular. Magdeburg, Henrike did tell me how to do this. Magdeburg is there for you. Moving on then to Henrike's people, where I was dealing with an individual, Henrike is dealing with a collective. Henrike works with the Lüneburg convents, the 15th century convents on the Lüneburg Heath. There were 6 of them, Ebstorf, Isenhagen, Lüne, Medingen, Walsrode and Wienhausen, and she's particularly focusing on Medingen.
Yeah, I'll show
there,
you later.
You'll show later, fine. Okay, don't get distracted. She's working she's actually working on a much bigger project than the one we're engaged in together, on bilingual devotion, and this is a case study of manuscript culture in late 15th century. And at the moment she's involved in a hunt across Europe for manuscripts. She's discovered 44 so far, and these are stretched in northern Germany out to Copenhagen in the north, Trier to the south, and Berlin to the east. So she's very mobile and very pathetic and needs a lot of money. But these devotional manuscripts are in Latin and in Low German. So we have a connecting point there in the language. But the interesting thing is that where I was dealing with an individual, Henrike is dealing with a collective. The nuns were writing together on these. We don't know them individually. So I just wanted to point out to some of the main themes in what we're working with. And linguistic transmission quite clearly, Low German, High German, and Latin. Low German is... No, I've done it wrong. Low German. Low German is closer to Dutch than it is to High German. And at this time, it was a language in its own right. These days, it's a dialect of German. So I think that's an interesting point. And it was the language of the Hanseatic League, so it was an important language in commercial terms. Latin, clearly the language of education, practiced in the convents where the women were concerned, and not so much outside of the convents, but it was used to transmit knowledge, mystical knowledge. This is just a snapshot of an extract from the manuscript, Einsiedel manuscript of Mechthild's work. It was originally in Low German. She was a Low German speaker, but unfortunately that text hasn't survived. So her writings actually reach the modern reader through a filter of High German. It was translated into High German in the 14th century. It was received very quickly by the educated, and it was actually then translated into Latin in the 13th century by Dominican monks. So you can see the linguistic transmission that is happening. But sadly, the actual Low German is lost to us. The Mating and Prayer books, bilingual production again, Low German and Latin, and these prayer books are unique in the variation of the mixed language that they're using in the same text. The ratio of vernacular language to Latin varies for every single manuscript. So sometimes it ranges from nearly exclusively Latin, where only the catchwords for the vernacular hymns are given in Low German, to nearly exclusively Low German manuscripts, where only the major liturgical points are marked by Latin beginnings. So the question arises, for whom are these written then? Why is this happening? Why is this transmission happening? In terms of religious status, my lady, Mechthild, was a beguine for the most part of her life. What that means is that she was a member of a community of women who chose to lead a life of voluntary poverty, chastity, and religious devotion, but in the secular world. So she wasn't enclosed in a convent. She did enter a convent, the Benedictine convent of St. Mary at Helfter, towards the end of her life. Helfter, this convent there was actually a centre of visionary writing and mystical experience, so she was among kindred spirits there. But the two women that she was alongside, another Mechthild of Hakeborn and Gertrude the Great, were child oblates, so they had been educated in Latin, they wrote in Latin, and their works are by and large collaborative. So again, you've got this balance between the individual and the collective. Medingen, there was a high production of prayer books, and these prayer books are interacting with the language of the Latin liturgy, vernacular songs, and non-text elements of the page. And they were used in modern terms, if you like, for widening participation. They were used in the convent, but also intended for lay people in the town. So there was a whole host of strategies to manage that. Other things that are interesting to us is that both our ladies were influenced very much by movements that came from the Low Countries. So the origins of the Beguine movement are to be found in the Low Countries, in particular in the Diocese of Liège, which is just there. And there was a surge in female piety at this time, which was to extend into the 13th century, and this movement of being poised between an enclosed life and the secular life came from there and spread across the north of Germany and indeed into the south and the west. In the 15th century, for Henrike's nuns, there was the so-called devotio moderna, modern devotion, a religious movement from the end of stretching from the end of the 14th to the 16th century. This stressed meditation, the inner life. It paid little attention to ritual and external works. It was immensely influential in Northern Europe and came again from the Low Countries. So we had this sort of drift of transmission from the Low Countries into the north of Germany. And then, well, what are they writing about? It's mysticism, visionary mysticism. Mechthild was a visionary. She had visions of hell, very lurid, very detailed visions of heaven. I always admired her that. I thought, gosh, imagine knowing what you're going to, you hope. And visions of purgatory too. Her kind of mysticism was what you would call affective mysticism. That is, it's mysticism that seeks union with the Godhead through love, through emotion, rather than through intellect and reason. The Medinger nuns are, if you like, a little removed from that. They don't talk about their individual experience of union with the Godhead. What they do is to draw on currents of writing, mystical thought and so on, to try and get themselves into a position where they can empathize with that experience. So they are, if you like, at a remove. I'm almost done. 13th and 15th century, we wanted to fill in the 14th century, and the lady that we're looking at there is Birgitta of Sweden, very influential figure. Her influence stretched right through Northern Europe, right through Southern Europe as well, and into Italy. She was one of the most charismatic and influential female visionaries of the later Middle Ages. And I'm aware that I've run over my time, have I?
You just fill in why you...
Okay. The reason that I've put this slide up is this is one of the Lüneburg convents of Lüne, and Birgitta actually stayed in the Lüneburg convents on her travels, and there is a window there to commemorate her. So Sancta Brigida, ora pro nobis, pray for us. So there is a very physical link, if you like, between these ladies, connecting the centuries and the physical presence. I think I should stop there and let Henrike move on, because she's now going to focus on a very particular aspect of transmission that she's discovered very recently, so this is hot off the press, as fresh as you get.
Yes, I just come back yesterday from the Lüneburg convent and take my camera, and so very exciting. There are still things to be found in the Lüneburg convent, because it's a singular area in that these convents are still there to be seen like they were in the 15th century. So none of them was destroyed. None of them was updated as well. Because in the Catholic area of Germany, you normally have Baroquization, so making everything new and fine, while these convents stayed as they were in the 15th century, because the Reformation, the Lutheran Reformation happened. They became Protestant convents, but that was just an organizational change, and all of their possessions stayed where it was, but nothing was added to it, since there was no any longer active saints devotion. They wouldn't add new saints to it, but they would dust and keep tidy what was there. So in Wienhausen, you not only have the outside. Wienhausen is here, Celle, but you have all of the insides. You have, for example, all the archival chests. These were coffers, are they called? What you would get as a dowry if you were a bride in the secular world, and you got such a dowry as a nun, a big trunk where to put all your clothes and where you put your manuscripts, everything that mattered to you. And there they are still. I just was there yesterday, and you can lift the lid and see the things underneath. And you can see how the nuns have, from the 13th century onward really, which was the period which Liz just mentioned, when the first surge of mysticism went through northern Germany. From the 13th century onward, you have things being transmitted through to the 15th century and then shock frozen, and now we can look at them as they were. So, for example, this is one of these manuscripts kept by the nuns for their personal devotion in their dowry chests, and it's a psalter. A psalter, the collection of prayers from the Old Testament, which was the most important book for daily prayers. And so you see the initial Beatus, with which the first psalm starts, fortunate is the man who walks in the ways of God. And this was written in the 13th century by an unknown nun in an unknown convent, but it was then given to the convent of Meding and a nun there, and this nun added in other material. You can see how carefully she stitched in new miniatures. So the basic psalters from the 13th century, stitched in are miniatures from the 14th century, and there you have now in full life size the head, which I appropriated to myself, of this Cistercian nun. And you can see it's quite incongruous. On the left-hand side you have a 13th century miniature, and in the right-hand side you have a 15th century miniature, and the nun who used it in the 15th century updated even herself, because if you look closely at her head, can you see this line running along here? There was an important reform movement. Elizabeth mentioned the Devotio Moderna sweeping through. So they took on a new habit with a pointed veil, with a red cross to symbolize the devotion to Christ. And so the nun cut out her head and pasted a new one with a new veil behind it to keep the psalter up to date. So that's my first case of transmission out of Meding. Then there is the point of transmission between the languages that Elizabeth also mentioned, and there the most important aspect for me is really how knowledge, religious knowledge, devotional knowledge, that had been the privilege of the religious people, becomes accessible to a much wider audience. And you see the nuns, you recognize them with a red cross on the veil, and there you see lay people. They don't have veils, they have a little flower wreath on their head to celebrate Easter with the nuns, and they hold a Low German banner, also heilig ist des Tag. This day is so holy that we should celebrate. So the nuns are singing Latin and the Low people are German. And I just recognized 2 days ago that I could really place that much more personally, because I discovered the name of the nun who wrote this prayer book. It's Mechthild Ehlebeck. She comes from a very wealthy family in Lüneburg, and her sister married the mayor of Lüneburg. And now in one of the Low German prayer books we have a prayer or an instruction saying, please say a prayer for your husband Heinrich Töbing. Heinrich Töbing was the mayor of Lüneburg. So I was able to connect these two manuscripts. On the top right-hand side is now in Hamburg and was brought specifically yesterday to the convent of Meding for the first time back in 500 years. And the other one is in Gotha now. And suddenly this links up a whole knowledge network between the Latin learning of the convent. So the nun writes for herself in Latin, while she writes, so she starts here, in Sacratissima Vigilia, in the Most Holy Vigil, while here she writes in Low German for her sister. And now another discovery, really hidden. This is the convent of Wienhausen, and one of their most treasured examples from the 13th century again, the risen Christ. And on Easter Day, there would be two angels put next to him on the tomb, and Christ would get a nice vestment on. And the two angels are lost, but Christ is still there, and all of their garments are still there. So this is, and the angels' wings are still there. So you can see there are holes for the garment to put the wings through, and that's what I just saw yesterday. That's the second angel, and you see it has rabbit fur down there, and the rabbit fur has to be backed to stay in place. And you can see peeping through underneath the rabbit fur, if you get it away with tweezers, there's text beneath. Because they used devotional manuscripts from the 15th century in the 16th century to repair the angels. So they were still enacting the devotion, but they weren't any longer using the old text. They had updated their own text, and it's an unknown until now Passion text from northern Germany, based probably on Passion plays. And we had known already from archival material that there was Passion plays performed, but we had never had a text from the convents before. So I haven't yet finished deciphering all of the text, because I only photographed part of it yesterday, no, the day before yesterday. But you can already see there are text from the play just inserted with Peter sprach. Peter said, or Jesus sprach, Jesus said. So the nuns of the 15th century transformed the Passion play into a devotional text in Low German for to read out to lay people, and when their successors in the 16th century ripped it up to still perform the rituals of Easter in their church. All right, so I'm over my time. Finish there. We've agreed we'll have a discussion at the end. So only questions now if something is completely unclear and I've muddled up the centuries or something like that. Otherwise, we'll quickly switch over to Laura. Yeah, and there is a handout.
The handout is not strictly necessary for the paper, so you can forget about it while you're listening. Okay. Scholars of Japanese medieval prose are well accustomed to the idea of textual mouvance when they study the transmission of medieval texts. In particular, this is true for scholars who work on the tales composed between the 14th century and the 17th century, collectively known as companion stories, otogizoshi. Now, these tales were normally anonymous. They were transmitted through manuscript, often illustrated, and in turn these manuscripts were frequently used for the basis overall performances. And we are in the realm of what Barbara Rusch has defined vocal literature, and it is no surprise that this specific form of transmission allowed the creation of numerous textual variants for each tale. The phenomenon of textual mobility recognized in Japanese medieval prose and justified by its scribal and vocal transmission does not vanish when printing is applied at the beginning of the 17th century for the productions of all sorts of texts. My interest today lays in understanding what happens to textual mobility in the transmission of Japanese early printed texts belonging to the sphere of popular prose and commercial print. This topic is crucial for the study of the nature of early modern popular prose, Japanese early modern popular prose, yet under-researched in the field of Japanese studies in the West, and only hinted to by scholars in Japan, but never systematically explored. As a matter of fact, the phenomenon of textual mobility remains in place in the transmissions of many of these early printed popular texts. So in what aspects can we detect mobility, and what are the typologies of variants that we normally encounter? Why do we find variants in early printed texts? How do these variants change the meaning of the text? Do they lead to a reconceptualization of the text? And by whom were these variants introduced in these texts? These are the main questions that I shall address today, and two are the works that I will use in order to exemplify my findings, Chikusai and Jinteki Mondo. Chikusai is a fictional and narrative text which recounts the story of a quack doctor named Chikusai, and which is characterized by a prominent hybridity at the level of the contents. The text can be divided in 5 parts. In the first and in the fifth, Chikusai and his servant visit Kyoto and Edo respectively, offering a guided tour of the two cities embellished by poetry. In the second and in the fourth part, the two main characters travel, first from Kyoto to Nagoya and then from Nagoya to Edo, and the text becomes a travel journey. The third and central part narrates the misfortunes of Chikusai as a quack doctor and his appalling pseudo-medical treatments in Nagoya. And it does so in the fashion of a comic jest book. Now, as you can see in chart 1, for those who have the handout, Chikusai enjoyed great popularity in early modern Japan and was published in 6 different editions. Jinteki Mondo is a non-fictional and substantially non-narrative text composed in the 14th century and formed around short dialogues occurring between Zenteki, a merchant of about 30 years old, and a monk named Yojimbo. The dialogues, prompted by the man's question, revolve around a plethora of phenomena. As you can see in material 1b, it circulated in manuscript form before and after the 17th century. But it was also made available in printed form since the beginning of the 17th century, and its transmission in printed form results rather complex. 8 are the movable type editions and 30 the woodblock editions that I was able to collect to date. And some of them actually are here with us today. Then you can look at them. Now, when we compare the different editions of each text in detail, we discovered that textual mobility and textual variance can be ascertained in their transmission at least 3 levels. First, the verbal texture may change, and modifications can take place on 2 levels. Micro-variants, such as single word or brief sentences, and macro-variants, such as the insertion or the removal of textual fragments of a more considerable length. Second, the script can be modified, and alterations of this kind normally imply a new equilibrium in the use of the 4 components of the Japanese script: Chinese characters, phonetic syllabary, hiragana and katakana, and the phonetic syllabary attached to the Chinese characters, furigana. Third, the material form of the book through which the text is transmitted may present alterations. In particular, interesting variants in the physical aspect of the book can be identified in the size of the book, in the page layout, and the illustrations, their presence, their absence, their dimensions, and their quality. As Donald Mackenzie has demonstrated in the West in his sociological study of bibliography, and as Roger Chartier and Jerome McGann have later advocated in their works, the medium does affect the message, and therefore variants in the bibliographical code constitute an essential part of my study. Let us begin with the first level, that of transformations which occur in the verbal texture. I have decided to leave the analysis of the microvariants aside for you today, you're very lucky, and to concentrate on a selection of the macrovariants detectable in the two works considered here. And I would like to start with Chikusai. A significant revision in content takes place when Chikusai shifts from the movable type edition to the woodblock edition around 1640. The major change is the inclusion of a new embedded narrative about homosexual love, nanshoku, which takes up more than a quarter of the text, 28 folios out of 72. The protagonists of this embedded story are two samurai, a man of a harima and the young Sasaki Uneme, who are completely unrelated to the protagonist Chikusai and to his story. The man of harima goes to a temple where he catches sight of a boy of about 17 years old, immediately falls in love with him. After sending him a letter, they met for one night, but further meetings result impossible. And suddenly a young man dies, and his lover becomes a monk after having attempted but failed suicide. Now, this is actually a long embedded story that creates a halt in the main text, in the main narration of the incompetent Dr. Chikusai. And it reinforces the genre hybridism which characterizes the text. The result is that, thanks to this textual graft, Chikusai becomes also an nanshoku text, a text about homosexual love. And moreover, this story works as an appropriative rewriting of a master plot which was popular in coeval stories of heterosexual love. Therefore, the appropriation of this master plot takes place in re-envisioning this plot from the point of view of male-male love. Now, the question we now face is why, at a certain point in the publishing history of Chikusai, the text changed in such an abrupt way. Following the suggestions that we find in studies by Ishii Yuko and Ishikawa Ryo, it is possible to justify this textual variation as a commercial response to the popularity that the theme of male homosexual love was gaining in the 17th century as a literary motif. As Iwata Junichi has proved, the period between 1624 and 1643 can be described as the age of young boys. And as you can see from these titles, many were the works wholly devoted to the theme of male-male love in 17th century. So the choice of the editor of Chikusai to graft an nanshoku tale onto the new edition of Chikusai can no doubt be attributed to a desire to appeal to potential readers by inserting a passage dealing with what was considered a fashionable theme at the time. Let us apply a similar analysis to Jinteki Mondo, where variants in the content appear even more extreme. Manuscripts of Jinteki Mondo already offer great mobility and can be roughly divided in two groups, those which have been copied before 1554 and those which have been compiled after 1585. Now, the common ground of all these scribal copies is that the dialogues are deeply imbued with the philosophical knowledge of a school of esoteric Buddhism known as Shingon. They refer to specific contents of Buddhist texts, and they also discuss links with the Indian Buddhist tradition to the extent that here and there Sanskrit script was used as well. But there is a prominent difference between the first group of manuscripts and the second, namely the number of dialogues, 23 in the former and 36 in the latter. Now, a closer analysis shows that we cannot talk about a simple addition of new materials. Four are, in fact, the basic dynamics that can be recognized in their transmission from the first group of manuscripts to the second. The addition of either whole sections or information, a process of detailing, which entails the provision of more details in each section and determines sometimes a division of one single section in more sections, the eliminations of either whole sections or parts of them, and changes in the order of the dialogues. Now, these transformative operations lay the ground for further transformations in the printed texts. What happens when Jinteki Mondo is put into print at the beginning of the 17th century? Against any expectation, no single manuscript is chosen as the source for the printed versions in movable types. Yet, many dialogues which were included in the second group of manuscripts are reused. Other dialogues have been erased and many new dialogues added. The total number of dialogues increases to 56 in the movable type edition and remains almost unvaried, even though never rigidly fixed in later editions. Let us take a closer look at the dialogues that we find in the first printed editions. Those dialogues which have been inherited from manuscripts undergo a process of rewriting, of transcreation that works around two basic principles: a process of detailing, so more details, and a progressive loss of the original Buddhist character. And you find some examples in English in Material 2b if you want to read a little bit about it later. Now, the loss of Buddhist character is further confirmed when we examine what has been deleted. Removed are all those passages whose content was deeply imbued with esoteric Buddhist philosophy and with scholarly references to Buddhist texts. In particular, the link with India is not denied, but certainly substantially reduced. The dialogues added anew further confirm this principle. They lack any reference to scholarly valid Buddhism and normally deal with the origins of many things. The origins of sake, the origins of markets, of writings, of letters, of umbrellas, etc., etc. And you can find some titles in Material 2a and some bits of translations in Material 2b. Now, what we notice when Chikusai Mondo is put into print at the beginning of the 17th century is that the Buddhist character of the manuscript is kept alive, yet weakened, in order to leave the place to a text which educates the reader through information about the origins of various things. The pre-17th century Jinteki Mondo is kept alive, adapting it to the needs of the new enlarged public of the printed text, not concerned with sophisticated Buddhism anymore, but rather hungry of practical information about the world they live in. This reconceptualization of Jinteki Mondo is justified also in the light of the new literary trends of the first half of the Edo period, 17th century. There was a real fascination for the origins of things, and a whole new genre revolving around this topic encountered the favor of 17th century readership. As you can see here, titles in this genre abound, and Jinteki Mondo itself becomes part of it. From this point of view, variations in the title, which was quite movable in early modern Japan, can be seen in later printed editions of the text, are particularly revealing. In an undated edition published in Kyoto, the external title includes, in the fashion of a complement title, the word Bambutsu ga Hajimari, the origins of all things. And in the internal title, they add Yurai Monogatari, almost the same, Tales of the Origins. And the 1830 edition, the last one published in Edo, offers as internal title Jinteki Mondo no more, but Bambutsu no Hajime, the origins of all things. It is interesting to note that Jinteki Mondo became a bestseller which survived throughout the whole Edo period thanks to its new identity of a book on the origins of things. Its modular structure, independent dialogues, allowed the later editions to cut dialogues and add new ones according to their own tastes. In its transmission, Jinteki Mondo is always the same, yet never the same. And this has allowed his survival from the 14th century up to the 19th century. Let us move quickly to the second level of variation that I have detected at the beginning of my paper. In other words, the transformations which take place in the script. For this level, I would like to concentrate mainly on Jinteki Mondo, as it provides an example that can be sufficiently clear. All the manuscripts of Jinteki Mondo are written with a predominance of Chinese characters and some katakana. Those who are learning Japanese here would find this text very strange, even though it is in Japanese, and those who are Chinese native speakers will find it very similar to what they expect from a text, though not in Chinese. Actually, the choice of characters and katakana is not a simply visual device, rather gives us an important information about the text. Numerous parts are written in corrupted classical Chinese, hentai kanbu. Now, classical Chinese used to play a role similar to that of Latin in pre-modern Europe. Hence, the manuscripts of Jinteki Mondo demanded a high literacy on the part of the Japanese reader. In the printed versions, though, katakana is substituted entirely by the easier hiragana, and the style bears no connection whatsoever with classical Chinese anymore. In other words, we find a process of an intra-linguistic translation, moving from a text in a very learned language to a text written in the vernacular. As time is running very fast, I would like to move briefly to the third level of variation in the transmission of these texts. So what variants do we find in the physical format? Normally, we move from a bigger size to a smaller size, and this apparently innocuous change allows the book to become cheaper and handier, hence more attractive for readers and easily sellable. Combined with the marvels of a pocket-size editions, another aspect of the bibliographical code is exploited in order to make the books attractive for potential customers. The insertion of illustrations. Let us consider Chikusai first. No illustrations were included in the movable type edition. The first woodblock edition contains 26 illustrations, which offered a rather crude rendering of human figures and landscapes. The following Urokogataya edition, on the other hand, reduces the number of illustrations to 15, but allocates 2 facing pages to each. This choice allows a more meticulous rendering of the details of each illustration, resulting in higher artistic quality. The realistic depictions of action scenes, the depiction of a specific social human categories, here is our young boy, and the imitation of the style found in guidebooks for the depiction of famous sites, this is the Kyoto Daibutsu not existing anymore, rendered this edition of Chikusai highly enjoyable as an illustrated book. This new generic dimension of the text is further amplified in the next edition issued by the same publisher, Urokogataya, when the illustrations are made by one of the leading artists of the time, Hishikawa Moronobu. In Jinteki Mondo, the increase of illustrations is a prominent feature of its transmission. Illustrations are added from this edition of the text, 1664. The first illustration occupies half a folio and depicts the tea house next to the temple Zenkoji, where the monk and the younger man engage in dialogue. There follow 44 smaller images included in the upper part of the page, and each of them visually depicts what the verbal dialogues relayed through words. And this is only one of the 3 patterns that we detect in the insertion of illustrations in the transmission of Jinteki Mondo. Suffices to say that when we come to the last edition, that of 1830, Jinteki Mondo fully becomes an illustrated book. Thanks to the expertise of Kitao Shigemasa II, active also in the production of woodblock prints, a certain artistic value can be added to the text. And it is time to wrap up what I have analyzed so far. The transformations that we have seen in the two texts analyzed today follow a specific logic. Variants in the verbal texture, in the script, and in the physical format are consciously introduced in the transmission of these texts in order to respond to the shifting tastes of the readership, in order to make this text widely accessible and easily sellable. In other words, all these variants allow the progressive popularization and commercialization of these texts, and their consequent survival over a period of time which far exceeds that of their composition. Now, who made these changes? Similarly to the medieval companion tales, 17th century books were normally anonymous, and even when a specific author was associated to a text, the phenomenon of textual move-ons was not jeopardized in any way. In early modern Japan, once a work was printed, the intellectual property of a single author on that text was immediately and completely lost. And once part of the collectivity, it would be changed ad libitum by anyone. And what has actually happened in early modern Japan? We can talk about multiple authorship. And in particular, the publishers, who were those who really beneficiated from the publication of books in early modern Japan, and who were also editors, printers, and booksellers, very convenient, were free to intervene on the texts in order to assure increased power of attraction for their customers. Many more steps must be completed in order to give form to this ongoing research project. First, the analysis conducted today on two texts must be applied to other examples composed in the 17th century. Second, at a certain point it will be necessary to reflect on whether this textual mobility remains prominent in all the genres of early modern popular literature, or whether there are genres which resist textual alterity. Third, there are other textual phenomena that need to be examined together with textual alterity. And for example, intertextual appropriation, new versions, sequels are part of it. Now, this constitutes different stages of my wider research project on Japanese 17th and 18th century popular prose, and this research will hopefully lead to a kind of renewed view of Japanese early modern literature. There is a last question that ideally we should address today. How can we produce critical editions that account for and value textual fluidities? In other words, how can we effectively transmit to new generations the complexity of early modern transmissions? I have no answer for this question, and I hope to engage in joint research projects with colleagues in the school who work on similar issues. What we need to bear in mind, I think, is that when we read a fluid text, we are reading the energy of a culture that makes the change. And certainly this is something that we need to familiarize our students with, so that they can abandon the naive idea of a unique, fixed, and authoritative text, as well as an easy notion of the author's final intention. There is sufficient ground here, I hope, to make research and teaching resonate in unison. Thank you.
I'll just change over. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm inspiring here. Can you open the door or increase the air conditioning or something? I'll soon quite spectacular and quite free. Sorry.
Henrike, for later, at the end. Okay.
Yeah, we should just have that's still not. I've started it on again. Yeah. We'll just.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. If you can't hear me, yell. If you don't understand what I say, talk to me afterwards. There are just two things I'd like to pick up on from my colleagues' wonderful presentations, and I'm afraid you won't get any history or anything, any old stuff. It's all looking forward, I'm afraid. But there are two things. One thing which Henrike said was, or Liz, I'm not sure, passing on the Latin knowledge in Low German to the lay people. And ultimately what I'm going to suggest to you is the passing on of the Chinese knowledge in Low English to the lay people. The other thing is, Laura talked a great deal about the commercialization, the popularity, the fashion of texts, and how stuff is added to make things more accessible for later generations and, of course, for people who don't speak the source text. And she also talked about the progressive loss of the Buddhist character. So as things go on, they get watered down. And we think it's terribly sad that the original texts are lost, you know, and there's all this vulgar, popular stuff. But maybe it's a good thing because it reaches other people. And that's one of the things I'm going to dwell on. Now, I'm sorry, there were two non-deliberate mistakes in the programme. One way is that was an 8th century poet, not a 9th century poet, and my name has got two T's. But I also have for you a deliberate mistake, and there's a fabulous prize for the first person to spot the deliberate mistake. Okay? So we'll go on. Transcreation as transmission. So what I'm saying again is echoing what Laura said. As we commercialise, as we make things fashionable, things change, and especially from one language to another. This is a very, very, very well-known poem. All the Chinese people in the audience will know it. Some of the non-Chinese people in the audience will know it. And I'm going to talk a little bit first about transcreation. So that's deliberate manipulation of the text, deliberately translating it or transferring it in an altered form. And how this has a communicative role and an artistic and creative role. How it is ideally suited to Chinese classical poetry. And then I'll talk a bit about Wang, his time, his poetry, and ultimately the transmission. Now, transcreation, I think the word has been most used in translation studies to refer to Sanskrit texts in the Indian tradition, and mostly the Hindu, the Ramayana, for example. These stories are retold so that new people can understand them. And Gopinathan has written quite extensively on this. What he says about translation is that it's like a shadow, as a shadow can differ from its original object depending on the intensity and the angle of light falling on it. A translation may also have a different form depending on the nature of light thrown upon it by the translator in his interpretation. So translation becomes transcreation, it changes. Inevitably, any translation changes a text. And above all, Gopinathan believes that it can break the myth of untranslatability. Now, those of you who in the audience who are or will be professional translators know that there is no such thing as untranslatability, because if you are given the job, you have to do it. You've got to translate it. Transcreation also has a more modern interpretation. If you go to the internet and look up transcreation, you will just get masses and masses of advertising websites. And in fact, there are companies called Transcreation because it's now recognized as it's a means of localization. So taking particularly an advertising or public relations text and suiting it to the new audience in a different country or a different area. So it's taking a concept in one language and completely recreating it in another language. So normally marketing, product or service. And I don't know if any of you read, I think it was the I paper, you know, the 20p Independent yesterday, had a big article on recreating or transmitting the magazine Cosmo, which is a very sexy magazine, to the Middle East. They've missed a few points, I think, but apart from that. So it can be a very modern idea as well. Now, back to translation. There are many problems with translation, with getting something across. Many people will say, well, you can't translate a text. It doesn't work, And in fact, I used to believe that. I used to think I could only read things in the original language because I wasn't getting the real thing in translation. But of course, the world can't go on if we believe that. We have to translate, and we have benefited hugely from translation. But there are problems. These are some which Lefebvre lists. So with so-called literal translation, I think many people nowadays don't believe that this concept exists. You have to smuggle in explanations. You cannot simply translate word for word because people will not understand. So you've got to explain with huge footnotes, for example. If you're translating poetry, you can use rhythm. So abandon the rhyme, abandon the meaning, abandon the grammar, but have a rhythm. And that can work to a certain extent, but even with a rhythm, you've got a quite rigorous straitjacket because it can get very monotonous. It turns into doggerel if you're not careful. And we can think of people like McGonagall from that point of view. If you turn your poem into prose, you maybe don't grab the reader's attention in the right way, in the way that the poet intended. You'll have emphasis on different words, you'll have different structures and so on. And you can get something which is neither prose nor poetry. Now, some poets would say, well, there is a thing called a prose poem, which you can aim at. But it does mean that you're maybe not quite getting the idea across. So fourthly, Lefebvre believes that rhyme transmits a caricature, and this is certainly very true if you are not careful. And I think if you read the accepted translations into English of, for example, 300-tongue poets, you find a lot of forced rhymes which sound very, very awkward and difficult. And people have turned sentences round to find a rhyme, and it just sounds horrible. So it can be very, very problematic. Finally, Lefebvre talks about a version. Now, his definition of version is that the substance is the same, but the form is different. So it's more or less equivalent to our idea of transcreation. And if you want to get the story across, if you want to get the message across and say, well, it doesn't matter about the language, I just want the audience to know, then the version is probably one of the best ways of doing it. Why do we want to use transcreation rather than translation? Now, there is much discussion about translation of literature. Many people would say that people who translate literature simply do it for themselves. It's just for the academics, for their own ego or all sorts of things. But if you really want to transmit this to another audience, transcreation might be the way to do it. You retell to suit an audience because they are different from the source language audience. They're younger, they're older, they're outside the cultural circle, or they're new to the cultural circle. And transcreation has gone on for thousands of years now in terms of fairy tales, fables, parables, myths, legends, religious stories, history, family traditions, and so on. And when you were little, probably your mum told you stories. She didn't necessarily read them from the book. She just told you the story again in her own words. And you said, Mum, you got it wrong. So it's a complete retelling, substance the same, but form different. Now, it has a very important artistic role because you can do it in different modes. You can retell in a different style or mode or version. So, for example, dance and mime. Again, the fairy tales, the great European and East Asian fairy tales, are retold in drama, in pantomime, in ballet, in all sorts of media. You also get retelling in pictures, and this I found very interesting because we had lots of pictures in the previous two presentations. And again, I think in last week or the week before, Saturday Guardian, there's a new publication about the illustrations for all the different versions of the 1001 Nights. And you can see the wonderful, irrelevant, wrong, but incredibly creative transcreations various artists have made of these originally Middle Eastern stories to suit their Edwardian audience, their Victorian audience, etc., their 1970s hippie audience, and so on. You have music, you have song, and you have poetry becoming prose and prose becoming poetry, and song and poetry going along together. Now, why would you transcreate apart from getting it across? Sometimes it's simply because the artist wants to do it. You feel inspired to redo this thing. Sometimes it's for a particular audience. It can be to get funding. So, for example, if you decide that you'd like to do a rendering of Wang Wei's poem as a ballet, and then you can apply to the Arts Council for funding. Or to teach. And I think this is my main motivation, and that is to use this as a teaching medium to get people interested in Chinese poetry. Here's just a very little example of what I would like to call a mutual transcreation, because as you can see, the poet has graffitied on the picture, or you could say, well, the artist has doodled on the poem. It's very common in Chinese culture to have a poem and a picture together, and they are transcreations of each other. The poem tells the picture tells the poem. Now, the particular case of Chinese poetry, I think most of you in the room will know that classical Chinese poetry is very succinct. It's very implicit because of classical Chinese grammar, so no pronouns, no declensions, no conjugations, no number, no gender, no articles, no capital letters, etc. So it's very simple, it's very implicit, it's very regular though, they're very, very regular forms, it's very rhythmic, and going back, Chinese poetry goes back at least 3,000 years written down, if not much further, and it was often based on song. The names of the meters and the titles of the poems often allude to the song, the original song form. And the great thing about classical Chinese poetry is that it doesn't really correspond to modern spoken Chinese or written Chinese. Now, do we read it or recite it? Is it silence or sound? This quotation is, I'm sorry, it's English, not Chinese, from a preface, I think a 3rd AD century preface to the Shijing, the great book of odes, the great classic of Chinese poetry, which contains poems which go back to 1000 BC. And what the preface writer said was, poetry is the fulfillment of intent. What dwells in the mind is intent. What comes forth in words is poetry. Emotions move in the core of one's being and take form in words. When speaking them does not suffice, then one sighs them or chants them. If sighing and chanting do not suffice, then unconsciously one taps them out with the hands, dances them, treads them, and stamps them. And I want you to bear this in mind, right? So Chinese poetry is not a sedate, fossilized textual genre, but a medium for movement and sound as much as for words. The poem which I'm going to talk about, and I know I haven't got much time, is a narrative poem. Chinese narrative poem is characterized by a point of view, so you have a person telling the story, characterization, you will get people in it who differ in their character, and a sequence of events. Now, there's a kind of parallel requirement for the qualities of poetry, which actually came later than Wang Wei's poem, but is equally relevant. Fu is the unfolding. Fu later came to mean the fu, the poetry style. But it's the unfolding or sequencing, the telling. Some people call it enumeration, but I don't like that very much because it kind of hints at numbers, which it isn't. It's a telling of the story. Then you have Bi, which is the simile, the metaphor, the figures of speech, the images. And then you have Xing, which really means that the meaning has to resonate. So you want resonance again. Now, China has many rhyming traditions. People on street corners and in theatres have dagu, xiangsheng, huaiba, which are all rhythmic ways of telling a story. And in the West, we have the great traditions of Onegin, the Fairy Queen, the Canterbury Tales, Hiawatha, lots and lots and lots of stories told as poems, very rhythmical poems. So, down to my poet, Wang Wei. He was a very establishment figure. He was a poet, artist, musician and official, a Buddhist and a vegetarian, and I think he's mostly well known for his Buddhist poems. He retreated to his estate and wrote lots of what we regard as Buddhist poems, so meditational views of nature and so on. He was writing during a period of huge cosmopolitanism in China. The Tang dynasty was a period when foreign things were fashionable and people wore very colourful clothes and had foreign religions and all sorts of things. So it wasn't the kind of monolithic Han period. He wrote Peach Blossom Spring at the age of 19. Now, what has happened over the centuries is that translations of that poem make him sound as if he was 90, not 19. You have these awful, plodding, rhymed, quasi-archaic poems, which are supposed to be translations of Wang Wei. And, okay, you know, they're translations in a way, but actually they are total rewriting. And so they're not really any different from a deliberate transcreation. So the poem itself is a traditional tale. It was originally told to Tao Qian, who lived around the 5th century, and Tao Qian wrote a prose preface with a poem following it. And it's been retold over the century in prose and poetry, and largely because of Wang Wei's poem, Peach Blossom Spring, that phrase came to mean a paradise, a utopia. So it's been transcreated monolingually in the Chinese tradition and in translation for foreign readers all over the world. Its features are as follows. It's a guti shi, as far as I can tell, so each line has 7 syllables, which works out at 4 beats, da-da, da-da, da-da. It has 32 lines, so we can roughly divide it into 2 parts of 16 lines. It's a narrative, a story, a journey, a search. There's a sense of other, because the protagonist meets very other people in the story. He has a dialogue with them. It can be chanted or reciting, and I won't deal with this now, but you know, there's a link between painting and poetry. Now, rap. Rap is a fairly modern form. It's quite old-fashioned now because it started as a recorded form in the 1970s and grew out of a much older tradition of signifying or telling the dozens on the stoop, on the step in America. So rap features are that it has a strict beat, 4 beats to a bar or line, just like Wang Wei's poem. It has a 16-line song, just like Wang Wei's poem. It has a strict rhyme, just like Wang Wei. It can be a story, a journey, a search. There's always a sense of other, very strong sense of other in rap. There's dialogue in rap, and of course it's chanted or recited, and I won't go into the painting and poetry bit. So, the poetics of rap. When a rap lyric appears on the page, aspects like rhyme schemes and enjambment suddenly become apparent. Our attention is heightened to the point of awareness of similes, metaphors, figurative language. It's a remarkable aesthetic experience to read, and when the song is heard in full, it's even better. Right? So nobody tell me rap ain't poetry. Right? Paratext. If you do use a long form like rap, it gives you the opportunity to add stuff, as Lara was saying, to make things more fashionable, more acceptable, to transmit information. You can add things, and rap is a perfect form for adding stuff. The narrative flow, and flow is a technical term, what you do when you do rap is you flow, allows for paratextual asides and explanations. It propels the text along. And of course this all contributes to effective transmission. As I said before, I think I'm winding up now, rap bears many similarities to Chinese poetic forms, content and intent. It's a medium which can be understood by 21st century Westerners and Easterners under the age of 40, or maybe even older. And above all, Wang was 19 when he wrote Peach Blossom Spring. I think if he lived in the 21st century, he would be a rapper. He would be a han-han. He would be an Ai Weiwei. He would not be a fuddy-duddy old person who uses archaic English. So it opens up inaccessible source texts, and I hope it would inspire young people. So there's your poem. That's the first. Right, and now I have a CD. So, do you know where I put it in?
Yeah, can't you do it yourself? Because
I haven't got it with me. It's just 1 minute, okay?
We should have done it before.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to. Want to hear it now?
I just have 1 minute.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, but I'm not
Are you sure the volumes are swelling the volumes down?
All right.
Yeah,
Yes.
The main on volume for a long time.
You could stay and listen to it over lunch if you're interested.
The hills are alive, it's spring, don't you know, as the boat runs fast on the downstream flow. Cutting the water clean as a blade, the fisherman's boat goes slicing through the glade. Hugging the bank in the oncoming spring, he looks at the mountains, just loving the peach flowers dangling. Dense as the stars, but soft, crowding in on the river and wafting all over the pebbly ford. His eyes all dazzled by the blooms ablaze, his oars went slack and he sat amazed, not knowing how far he drifted from home, only that he was all alone. He sailed right down to the end of the stream, alone as a dreamer, dreaming a dream. A mountain cavern came and swallowed him whole, and the boat tumbled on in a glorious roll through winding caves and curious boulders, till he felt a draught of air on his shoulders. The hulking stones of the mountainside stood back, and the cavern opened wide on a warm golden plain that met the horizon. Far in the distance he suddenly sees a whole lot of towering canopied trees, lean and splendid and growing proud, so tall they definitely pierced a cloud. Then closer by, and he nearly didn't see, all nestled in the flowers and among the groves, was a bustling village of 1,000 homes. The fisherman left his boat and began to greet all the villagers, woman and man, by mentioning the name of the dynasty of Han.
Okay, enough?
But they all stared, not knowing a word. Everything he said sounded...
Right. Okay. I'm sorry, it's nearly 6 minutes long altogether, so it's a smidgen longer than the actual poem. But if you want to hear it, you can listen to it in the lunch hour,
we'll
right?
put it up on the
Yes.
internet. Yeah.
Yes, and if anybody has discovered the deliberate mistake yet, let me know.
Could you just stay here, Laura and Liz, if you come, because I would really like to wrap up
the moving transmission between all these languages, centuries, genres we've heard so far. And I think for me there were a few themes coming through. The strong didactic impetus of transmission is really something didactic and commercial. I'll get the volume down in a second. Yeah. Okay. This really, why do you transmit? For whom do you transmit? Is something that came out quite strongly, and I think it has a specific pre-modern tinge to it, that it works differently in the for pre-modern audiences than it does today. But the floor is open to you for suggestions, ideas, questions, whatever. Oh, yes.
Something just hits me, which you may think is daft. If you love something, and if you love somebody, you want to share that. And I think that's why people translate and teach and make conversation and all the other things that you do in life.
Yeah. I think enthusiasm is a good transmitter. Definitely. I think all the people we have been talking about or hearing about, the translators or the nuns, are passionate about their subject, and that's why they want to transcreate or so on. Well, perhaps the publishers were more in love with the money, but
there is a very nice illustration in an 18th century book with the publisher, instead of the head, he has a big gold piece which was used as money, and that tells you everything about publishers in early days.
Yeah, and
this is a very nursery question, Laura. How did you get hold of those manuscripts?
This actually are a printed text that you can buy in Tokyo. Some of them are very cheap. Some others are very expensive. So in Italy, we used to have a bonus in January. So the bonus, this is the bonus where it went. But a lot of the other texts are taken from libraries, because when it comes to these are woodblock editions, so they can be very cheap, and they were cheap at the time. But movable type editions are just in archives.
Francis?
I think what I liked, which I really hadn't expected before I came, was how you're all treating very similar things about how stories are passed on to new publics and to reach a wide new public, you know, whether it's via translation, whether it's via transmutation, or whatever. I thought it was really great. Just maybe like to look specifically at what Valerie was. One of the slides you presented is Le Favre, his famous, really sour 7 ways in which poetry translation fails, betrays. You know, so if you put rhyme in, it shackles. If you're free, you're too free. I think your version showed that these are ways of translating poetry needn't be shackled. You just got to simply free yourself.
And I think it's what this lady says, it's about if you love someone and something, you want to do it. And I think poets who love translating probably can do it, you know, without all these ghastly things happening. But I think Le Favre, and I don't want to sully his name, it was a very early book, and I think it may have been his PhD, I think. And I think at that stage you often say, well, you know, I am right, I'm going to change the world. And so he was saying all these people can't do it, and he offers his blueprint. But in fact, really there's a qualifier, and that is that rhyme is no good if you don't do it properly. Blank verse is no good if you don't do it properly, and so on. But it has to be done with love, and one hopes with talent as well.
Joe?
Maybe just adding on to the love bit, I was thinking it's also quite a lot about just beauty and embellishment, isn't it? Really, not necessarily always thinking of the audience that you're going to deliver to, but beauty in itself. And just looking at your transmission slide there, from the caterpillar to the beautiful butterfly, I think there is a process. It came out in your books as well. The illustrations kind of got better and more beautiful.
And actually,
exactly.
Exactly. I mean, for early modern Japan, when it comes to commercial print, I mean, when they wanted to sell the book with a higher price, they just asked to a woodblock printer who was famous, well renowned, and he could put his name. We don't find names of the authors. In many cases, we just find names of the illustrators, because they were, in a way, beautiful print illustrated books.
Yes, and I think there's a bit of a tendency to do that now with some of these editions of, say, Alice in Wonderland and The 1001 Nights. Absolutely beautiful illustrations, not necessarily at all realistic to the way the text first.
Guy?
Yeah, I'm interested in the tension between this kind of search for origins and the fascination with origins, which came out in particular when you were talking there about the Japanese market that had a demand for finding out, reading about the origins of things, and also this idea of actually you can have transmission and transcreation once the original has been lost. So in the example that Liz mentioned earlier on, the idea of actually the original version, which I think was in Low German, of a certain text had been lost, but you still get transmission in the absence of the original. But presumably there is a tension in people theorizing and working in and around transmission, translation, transcreation, between that search for the authentic and the original, and actually the activities which go on in the absence of the original, in the absence of interest in kind of returning to origins. I wonder if you have any comment.
Well, it was a very 19th century concept in German, this Ur, the sort of the original thing that you were looking for, and so much effort was dedicated to try and reconstruct the original text. But I think people have moved much further to what Laura was talking about, this acceptance of variation, and don't get worried about that, as it were, that it's all valid, that actually you can treat these as equals in a sense. So I think that opens up a lot more then. I think nowadays that tension of, I mean, there is still that longing though. There was a recent discovery of a manuscript, a fragment of Mechthild, and there was great joy in the community. So original. So that I think that longing is always there, that you want to get back to it. But I don't think that, in a sense, it's just one direction, but actually you've got the whole richness of it. And I think where that richness was tended to be neglected and downplayed, it wasn't as valued as highly as it should have been in the search for the original.
I really appreciate your ending with a question of fluidity and edition. How do we edit this? Because I think with digital editing, we are in a completely new state of the play with addressing this movals of the text over time. Because the 19th century position was, well, the ur-text and nothing but that. And then the 20th century new philology says, oh, everything goes. We just take the surface of how the text presents it in its umpteenth form and xerocopy that, put it out as the text. But that again isn't. We don't want only the bit with the homosexual love inserted in this other without seeing how it came about. So I think with really new forms of recording, sound recording, combining that with different images, with additions, really creating a three-dimensional way of the text that shows its history shining through the later emanation. That's the way forward.
Yeah, and actually we could do a whole conference about this, actually, because maybe. But the crucial point is, which is taken up, as Liz was saying, by latest philologists, is that we cannot and we don't want to recreate, because it is a recreation per se, the lost original text that was in the mind of the author. We can't do that. Now, how can we do this? How can we present all the different variations. Well, Bryant, the one I am quoting, and I quoted it also in the handout, actually is proposing a method that links to what Henrike was saying, to use all the digital materials and so on and so forth. But when we come to Japan, for example, we have a whole bunch of problems to deal with, not only technical, but also with a tradition of Japanese philologists who just collate diplomatic transcriptions of this version, this version, this